When I first arrived here 15 years ago now, we were told, I was told, that they needed a presence, a United Methodist presence out in the eastern part of Colorado Springs. At that time, Falcon was the growing community. So that was sort of the way we referred to the possibility that we ought to have a church in Falcon, ought to have a church in Falcon. I was an old downtown church preacher. Other than 3 years as a student pastor, all I had done in all of my ministry had been city center, old downtown churches. I knew a whole lot about a little bit, and I knew a whole lot about old downtown churches. And I loved them. I loved the diversity, I loved the energy, I loved the passion, the things that make up a downtown church. And I didn't know anything at all about suburban ministry and really didn't have a sense of call or passion for that. So, frankly, I just laid it aside. I thought, yeah, that's probably right. There's a lot of people moving out there. There's a lot of growth. Things need to happen. But I just never felt that nudge upon me and upon our congregation to do that until just several years ago. And I realized that we were probably the only congregation in a place to be able to do something like that at the magnitude that it needed to be done. And part of it was just in sermon preparation. I was working on a sermon on the talents. And I had a moment in that sermon preparation where I realized that I had spent most of my ministry protecting my church from itself, whether it was here or other congregations as well. This sort of sinking feeling in my heart that I always tried to limit the risk that my congregation made and things. But it was really one of those powerful moments when I realized that by me protecting the congregation from risk, what I really was doing was blocking them from doing what God could be doing through them. And it was a moment of repentance. And so as I worked on that sermon and thought about risks that we ought to be taking as a congregation, that was the risk that came to mind. I did not mention it to staff. I did not tell anybody I was going to talk about it in the sermon. But there in the sermon on the talents came a challenge. And so it was a moment of recognizing my own failures and my own limiting God's work, and somehow finding the courage at that time to respond to that.
Well, we launched our public worship service in April 2019, but there's a whole story and journey before that, a whole emotional roller coaster before that. It started in November of 2018. The senior minister of First United Methodist Church, Kent Ingram, he preached a sermon on the parable of the talents. And none of us had any idea what the sermon was about. I'm sitting up there on the chancel, and he's preaching this sermon about, the various responses. Some people buried their talent, others went out, and multiplied it twofold, tenfold, all of that. And he talks about how at First United Methodist Church, we've been burying our talents. And the church has a long history of planting churches. They've planted 3 churches before, but it's been 30 years since FUMC planted a church. And so in the middle of this sermon, he says, it's time. It's time. We've been playing it safe. We have to take risks for the gospel. We have to reach new people with the good news of God's extravagant love in Jesus Christ. And so what we need to do, what God is calling us to do, is plant an additional campus of the church out on the eastern plains of Colorado Springs. And I turned to one of the other associate ministers next to me and I said, do you know what he's talking about? And they were like, no. And so, I found Kent after the service and I said, are you serious? And he's like, yeah. And, something just rose up in me right away. This is it. This is it. This is the next step for me. This is my calling going forward.
I preached that sermon. Patty was in the service that week as a liturgist. By the time I got home at 12:30, I had a text from Patty saying, if you are really serious about this, I'd like to talk to you about being pastor at that campus. And I have to admit, it never occurred to me that Patty Walker might want to do that. She had asked to work less than full time. She had children in school. She was trying to have a marriage and a family and all those other kind of things. And I thought she was kind of where she wanted to be in terms of her time commitment to the life of the church. But boy, when she extended that offer to me, I knew that God was at work in this in lots of different ways. And so we began a conversation there. And best decision I've ever made, perhaps, is to ask her to do that. But it was immediate for her as well. So.
A faith community being a church plant is not a foreign idea to me. I grew up in a church plant in Bloomington, Indiana, in the late 1970s, and we met in a school. My very first Sunday school memories are in the shop classroom, the industrial arts. We met in this middle school. So I remember I would bring my Bible and I would lay it out on this huge drafting table, and we'd sit on these tall stools, kind of like this, and that's where I first heard the stories of Jesus. So for me, I've always known that church, it's not some amazing building. The church is a people wherever they gather. So my faith journey is I grew up in this really conservative evangelical church, almost a fundamentalist church. And so as a young person, I wanted to get as far away from that as possible. So I became United Church of Christ. I loved the theological freedom, the commitment to social justice. But things I love about my evangelical upbringing is this commitment to evangelism, to always wanting to share the good news. It's not something for us just to keep for ourselves, but it's for the transformation of everybody. So I eventually made my way to the United Methodist Church, which is a whole other story. But I found a real spiritual home in the United Methodist Church because I feel like the United Methodist Church brings together some of those really wonderful things about both spiritual traditions that I've been a part of. That commitment to evangelism and personal piety and my evangelical bringing, and then, the commitment to social justice and inclusivity in the United Church of Christ. So anyways, that's why I love the United Methodist Church. And out on the eastern plains of Colorado Springs, it's a very conservative area, heavily military area. So politically, religiously, culturally, very conservative. Colorado Springs in general is a very conservative place, but out east, even more so. Here in Colorado Springs, we're home to the Navigators, Focus on the Family, David C. Cook, lots of big mega evangelical churches. So out on the Eastern Plains, there is no, I would say, open-minded, inclusive presence. There's no mainline Protestant presence way out there on the Eastern Plains. So I feel this tremendous, blessing and excitement and urgency in creating a faith community out there that is open-minded and inclusive and Christ-centered.
I was suspecting you had a lot of people that came from lots of different places to settle out in the eastern part of our city. Jobs brought them there, military brought them there, and I was guessing that a lot of those people did not have deep roots in our city, did not have a lot of experience in our city, and therefore didn't have community in our city. And I could imagine there were a lot of probably lonely, isolated folks and families out there that could benefit from having a community to pull them together.
Wow, this journey of being a church planter, I had no idea what I was getting into, which is good because I'm not sure I would have taken that leap. It's like falling off this cliff. It's terrifying. It's exciting. Being a church planter has absolutely been, one of the most wonderful and scary and stressful things I've ever done. It's a lot like becoming a parent for the first time. You really have no idea what you're getting into. Other people can talk to you about it and explain it, but really until you're holding that newborn. And just like being a parent, I think is the best and hardest thing I've ever done, except for church planting. What a journey. One of the first things that we started doing as we were exploring the idea of planting a church out east is we went and visited all the church plants that were already out there. And Colorado Springs must be a really kind of hot market for church plants or something, because every school pretty much has a church plant in it already. And there's most of them are young men who are coming up from the South. And they're planting as non-denominational churches, but if you kind of dig beneath the surface, you find out some denominations that are supporting them. So anyway, so I visited all these church plants, and then I went to coffee with all these church planters. And I have to say, that's a really wonderful way to learn about the area, to learn about church planting there. And, I have to say, part of me beforehand was wondering, all these young men from a more conservative background, how are they going to feel about me as a female church planter? There's not a single female minister out in this area, let alone a female church planter. But I have to say, they were so gracious, so wonderful. Our theological differences just melted away as we had this common passion for reaching new people with the good news of God's love. So that was a great thing. It's just to meet as many church planters, go to coffee. I think, if you've been on this journey, you just want to give back. You're so excited when somebody's starting and you want to help them as much as you can. In the Gospels, we meet that fiery character, John the Baptist, and he talks about making straight the highways for the Lord. And that's a big part of, my vision and the vision of the core team as well, that we want to remove the obstacles for young people to come into the Christian faith, to have this life-changing experience of God in their lives. But the Pew Research Center, they did this study, I don't know, it was a while ago, but they asked millennials, what's the number one word that comes to your mind when you think about Christians? And the number one word was judgmental. And the second one was anti-gay. So, I think a lot of young people, when they think about the Christian faith, they think, well, that's fine for grandma, and, I'll go to church with grandma when she's in town, but, it's not for me. It's this antiquated, old-fashioned thing that's out of step. I think a lot of young people think that the church is anti-gay, that it's anti-women, that it's anti-science. And for me, that is so heartbreaking. And so I really want to create this faith community, again, that can reach young people and say, there's another way to be church in an open-minded, inclusive way that values the leadership of women, that believes in the findings of science, that welcomes gay people into all levels of the church life. Make straight the highways for our Lord. I think being a church planter has ruined me for just being a normal church minister. I kind of live in fear that the bishop someday is going to appoint me to some church, that's been around for 150 years. Even though being a church planter is so much work, and there's this level of stress that is unparalleled, I think, in typical church ministry. There's just so many incredible blessings. You're creating something new. You get to be a part of creating the vision and the values and all of that from the beginning. And the people coming along with you, for the most part, that's their vision and value and their passion as well. So that's an amazing thing about being a church planter. One of the first things I did was I went to Exponential East, which is this huge church planning conference. It was down in Orlando, Florida in February, so that was really fun. But anyways, there were thousands of new church planters there. And it was an amazing experience, but also I really felt like a fish out of water because there were so few women there. I went to, there was a breakout group about women in church planting. So I finally was like, oh, this is great. I'm going to find my tribe. So I go to this session, and it turns out 99% of the women there were spouses of church planters. And the whole conversation ended up being about basically, is it okay for women to have leadership roles in church planting when they're supposed to be, submissive and, all of that. So it didn't have anything to do really with, my journey of being a church planter. So that was just an interesting dynamic. So, and also is predominantly, again, kind of conservative, evangelical, non-denominational young men church planters. I learned so much at it. even though, again, I kind of felt on the outskirts and not your typical church planner there. I went to this one breakout session where they talked about finding common interests with new people. So it's all about, how do you find new people in a community and to begin to develop relationship with them and begin that process of discipleship making. It starts with friendship and relationship and all of that. So they said, find common interests, and then, you could do meetup groups or, have various ways of bringing people together. So they said, find that hobby that you're doing anyways, whether it's kayaking or biking or whatever it is. So I thought to myself, I was like, well, what are my hobbies? And I was like, I don't have time for any hobbies. I'm a minister, I'm a mom of 3 kids. My hobby is really like shuttling my kids around to their hobbies and their sports and their music and all of that. So then that made me stop and think, well, that's it. That's my connection. My natural connection with other people is being a mom, and is being a companion and creating community for other moms. So it was at that point there. I remember there was this desk there at Exponential of the MOPS organization, Mothers of Preschoolers. So I went over there and had a great conversation with them, and I thought, this is it. This is where I'm gonna start. I'm gonna create this MOPS group and get to know the young moms in this area and befriend them and be friends with them, and that's gonna be a major part of this church planning strategy. So along with creating this MOPS group, my other initial idea was I was gonna have a VBS, a Vacation Bible School. And one, it's a great way to reach young kids and tell them about Jesus and introduce them to a relationship with Jesus. But I also knew free childcare as a mom is key. When my kids were really little, I would find every VBS, it didn't matter, what denomination, but every week I would send them to VBS, and that would give them something to do in the summer. And so we had this VBS, and we did it in the school that we knew we'd be planting in. So this is the summer before we launched in April. And we had 84 kids show up, free childcare. It's a good thing. So that was also a great way to begin to meet people in the neighborhood. That summer before we launched, another thing that we did, another evangelism strategy, is that every week we had a booth at the farmer's market. And we wanted to have something to draw the kids over to our booth, because we knew if we drew the kids, then the parents would come. And we wanted something that would keep the kids there for a while, so we'd have a captive audience with their parents. So I bought this button maker, which I have to say is one of the best investments that I ever did for this church plant. So the kids would come over and they would get to create their design for this button maker and for the button, and then we would take it and stamp it and press it and make a little button that they could wear. So the whole time they're creating their masterpiece, I'm getting to talk to their parents and tell them about the church that we're planting and all of that. So that was a great way to bring in a few families before we had even launched.
I met Patty the summer before the church launched at a farmer's market in Banning. I was walking through with my boys, and the first tent we came to was kind of this bright green tent with the most friendly person outside of it, and she immediately kind of drew us in. And as my boys were making buttons and making bracelets and necklaces out of cereal, she and I were able to connect, where she was able to tell me kind of about the new church that was going to be launched here within my neighborhood. What kind of struck me the most about this church and excited me the most was that it was Methodist. I was raised a Methodist, and my husband and myself attended the downtown campus prior to having children. It also excited us that it was in our own neighborhood, within our own community, so it was so close to us, to our home. So we waited the better part of a year for the church to launch, and when it launched, we have been members since. We've been active in the church. We've been involved in the church.
And at the farmer's market, it wasn't just, the people who were stopping by, but sometimes it was developing a relationship with the vendors on either side of you. So, for example, my good friend now, Tracy Geiser, I met her. She had a Osborne book booth right next to me. And so that whole 2 or 3 hour shift that afternoon, we're talking and it gives me a great chance to get to know her. So that's the thing is, wherever you go as a church planter, whether you're getting your hair cut or you're at the grocery store or wherever you are, it's always this opportunity to invite people to church. So as I said, that summer we did the Vacation Bible School. We had a booth every week at the farmer's market. So I was getting to meet young moms through both of those situations. So then in the fall is when we started our MOPS group, when I invited, all those women that we had met. And I feel like in some ways I had to work much harder than a church planter who is living in the community in which they're planting already. That's one of the things I'll just say. You should live in the community that you plant in. I do not. And that is a big challenge. But for me, we live in the mountains. My husband wasn't going to give up living in the mountains. My kids had their schools. And that was just one of those personal things that I was asking my family to sacrifice so much. As a church planter, really, it's not just hard on the church planter at times, it's really hard on the family. So it's one of those things that I just had to weigh for their mental health and all of that. I wasn't going to move them 20 minutes to the other side of Colorado Springs. But that has made it challenging for me. So anyways, I'm always looking for ways to be involved in the community. So this MOPS group again was a great way to do that. So we launched it that fall, and it wasn't huge. There were about 15 young moms, but that gave me the opportunity to do the slow work of relationship building. There's a book out on church planting. I think it's by Daniel M. I think it's called No Silver Bullets, and there are no silver bullets in church planting. I think I thought beforehand, I didn't know anything about church planting really beforehand, but I think I thought, you'll do this mass direct mailer postcard and you'll have billboards or, and people will come. And maybe in the 1950s that did work because there was a whole culture, supporting church going. But now, it's still good to do all that, and we did all that marketing and all of that. But really, it's the slow work of relationship that is critical to a church planting success. So there's no easy thing. It's just getting to know people, being involved in their lives, and through that, inviting them into a relationship with Jesus and being a part of a church. So at the farmer's market, we did that. We've done that 2 summers now. Do you know what the number one question is that people ask me when they find out about the new church? I thought it was going to be, what do United Methodists believe? Or what does your church teach or believe about the Bible? I was all prepared for these deep theological questions. The number one question I get is, what is the music like? What kind of music do you have? That's what people care about. So I knew that hire was probably the most important hire. It was incredibly important. I have enough humility to know that people come less for my preaching and more for the amazing music of my worship director, which is Justin Anderson. He's key. He is such a blessing to us. He has a really interesting history. Like me, he came out of an evangelical background, but at some point that theology just didn't make sense anymore. And he and his family were also searching for, a more open-minded, inclusive faith community. So he's just a great fit for us and a wonderful person.
We're an old downtown church, and we've been here forever and ever. And there's always this fear, I think, in an old downtown church that we're gonna neglect the old folks. We're going to neglect the building. We're going to neglect our place downtown. And I assured them that I want to be here. I love this place, and I love the people here. But I expected more anxiety and pushback around trying to relocate and put energy into another place besides the downtown. Because like all churches, and especially downtown churches, you scratch and claw to keep your nose above water, to get new people to do the ministry of the church. And obviously this was going to stretch that. It was going to pull us in a way that was going to take resources and energy and people away from the downtown setting. But very, very little, if any, resistance to that idea. People seem to catch that vision and understand the why behind that. And that felt like a God moment for me, too.
I want to share a little bit about the specific kind of church planting that I'm involved in, and that is multi-site church planting. So when there's a church, a sending church, that is going to remain connected to the new faith community. So that's what we are. The Prairie campus is a satellite campus of First United Methodist Church in Colorado Springs, and I think this type of church planting is there's just a lot of advantages to it, because the sending church feels incredibly invested. I mean, I think it's kind of like a parent with a child. You're going to do whatever you have to do to sacrifice to help your child, whether it's scrimping money to save for them to go to college or all that. You're all in. This little being is a part of you. So with a multi-site, there's that level of self-interest, you could say, which God can use all things for good, right? So for me, it's just been an incredible blessing to not be a church planter who's just out there on their own, but to have this sending church, the downtown campus, that is all in, fully invested in the success and thriving of the Prairie campus. We formed our core team the early fall before we planted in April. And I was really intentional. We had a core team and a launch team. And the core team was this kind of smaller circle of folks who early on were just all in, really saw this as part of their vocation, being a church planter. And I figured some people would fall by the wayside, which they did. So I started with 16, hoping I would end up with 12 when we finally launched. And that's exactly what happened. About 4 fell away, but I had these 12 amazing worker bees all in who had caught the vision. So we started meeting once a week, and we started each week, a different one of us shared our faith journey, kind of our personal testimony. And that was time so well spent. And each week we did Bible study as well. I remember that first week we started with, the classic passage of when Jesus is calling the disciples out on the boat and says, "Come and follow me. I will make you fish for people." And every week we had these picture frames around of people, casting their nets out on the lake, and so we had all these visual images that we journeyed with that whole fall, that Jesus was calling us to fish for people. We knew that what we were creating, this little small group, the faith community that we were creating, that we were going to be the paradigm for this new church. So it's really important to us to ground ourselves in spiritual disciplines, and that really, our relationship with Jesus was going to be at the core of this. So I look back on those times with great fondness. That was the baby church just starting right then.
I have to say that I was slowly thinking about doing this. We were very entrenched in choir and Sunday school classes here at First Church, and I kind of took a slower kind of going forward, but then Patty drew Randy and I into a core group of couples that we helped to plan and get together and pray and think about the spiritual connection that we all had and how we could use that.
For recruiting the core team, the way I went about that is, I sat and I prayed and I thought about the folks that I really wanted to ask. a wonderful thing for me is I've been on the staff of First United Methodist Church since I think it was 2012. So I'd been on staff for 6 years. So I'd had 6 years where I could really develop relationships with people, really kind of be grounded and established in the sending church. So that's a huge thing in being a multi-site church planter, if at all possible, that the church planter has really been a part of the sending church. So anyways, I came up with those 16 people, and then I invited them all out for coffee, and had that one-on-one time with them to share the vision and the values, and hopefully catch their passion as well. Then along with that core team, a few months later after that, so we're kind of late fall at this point, before that April launch, I started forming the launch team. So for us, the launch team was another circle of involvement. Not, maybe not quite as much of commitment as in, doing work every week with, evangelism, building relationships, the planning, the administration, all of that. But people who would commit to being a part of the New Faith community for 1 year. Now, I really struggled with that. I know church planters have different, multi-site church planters have different feelings about that. Some people just ask them, be all in, do this forever. But for me, I just asked people for a year because I wanted them to say yes. And I'll tell you, it was hard getting people to be willing to leave the downtown campus with me and go out and plant this new church. There's a lot of love for the traditions and the people in the community of the downtown campus. And so I asked for 1 year, but I will tell you, we're 2 years in now, not a single one left and came back downtown. So that's what I think, say a year, but then hook them and get them, and then they won't want to leave. I remember reading somewhere that the most important thing you can do before you launch is have a really robust, healthy launch team. That you need this critical minimum number of people to be able to fulfill all those volunteer roles that you're going to need for that first year, until you're really, incorporating new people, and then training them and getting them in their service. So, you need the number of folks for your setup and tear down team, which if you're in a school and church plant is pretty substantial. Your children's ministry, your hospitality and welcoming ministries, and all of that. So again, I think that was really good advice. I can't remember who told me that, but they were like, hey, for this church plant to be successful, you have to have a really healthy launch team, minimum of 35 people. Well, I had thought, I'm going to have 50 to 75 people. This is what we had originally thought in planning this. But as I said, it was really, when it came down to it, it was really hard for people to leave the sending church. So I ended up with pretty much exactly 35. And I will tell you, that was the absolute minimum. And it ended up working and it was good, but I would not start a church without that 35 launch team. And then, of course, alongside that, I had the new people that I've been developing relationships with in the community. So the farmers market people, the MOPS people, the vacation Bible school people, those as well. And for those who were willing, I incorporated those into the launch team. So to bring the launch team together as a community, before we launched in April, we had potlucks after church. And we would share the vision and values there at those. And we also really focused on personal evangelism at those potlucks. I would have time for people. I would literally give them a piece of paper and pencil, and I'd say, okay, let's sit down and let's pray. Let's think about who you can invite. What friends and coworkers and family and all of that. And I'd give them all little invite cards. And we created some events before we launched that they could be inviting their friends to. So I think we did a Christmas children's craft making workshop. We did this Valentine's dance, kind of hoedown, square dance thing. So just some fun things where they could start getting in the practice of inviting people. And I'll tell you, it's a struggle for us as a church. It's something that I think we really need to continue to work on. I think as a mainline Protestant church, it's just not part of our culture. Side note here, my son's piano teacher, he's a new piano teacher, and I heard them talking the other day, and the piano teacher, he's a young man, he's part of a evangelical church plant here in town, and during the course of the piano lesson, he invited my son Luke to his church, my 8th grader, and I thought it was great. Maybe some parents would be offended by that and think that's not part of the piano lesson, but I was like, wow, like, look how naturally that happened. Like, just taking every opportunity to say, hey, would you like to come to church with me? And that's what in the mainline Protestant church, we need to start doing that, because the power of personal evangelism just dwarfs all other things. All the studies have shown that if you personally invite somebody to church, I can't remember what it is, but it's some huge percentage of folks, they'll say yes, and they'll come with you. Whereas if they get a postcard in the mail, it's like, half of 1% are going to do it. So really, the way churches grow is by people inviting people to church. I just want to say that if you're a church planner and you're listening to this, I have such sympathy for you that month before you launch. It's just going to be insane. Maybe you're hyper organized, and I'm pretty organized, but still, at that last month, there's just so much to be done. So be graceful with yourself, but and also you'll find yourself doing all these things that you think, man, in seminary, they never taught me how to do this. So for example, one of the things I had to do that last month was go out and purchase our storage container, our Connex container that we put all our supplies in. And I remember just walking around this container yard thinking, I have no idea what makes one storage container better than the other one. There's just so much to do. Getting that website going, your Facebook page, the e-newsletter, again, all the publicity, figuring out all the volunteer roles, making sure you have all your supplies. We were really lucky and fortunate. We did contract with Portable Church Industries, also known as Church in a Box. So we purchased a whole system, which I have to say, if you have the funding for that, it really is incredibly convenient, because everything is in these rolling containers, and it's all organized, and set up and tear down is such a huge thing for your volunteers. And so whatever you can do to make it as easy as possible. It still takes us probably an hour to an hour and a half to set up each week, and to tear down maybe 45 minutes. So still a big commitment. But again, whatever you can do to support your volunteers with that is highly worth it. Another thing I wanted to say is, I think one of the most helpful things that I heard from a church planter beforehand was, he said that the first year after he had launched his multi-site campus, every Sunday morning he threw up. He was so anxious that he would, get to the school, they'd be setting up, and he'd have to go into the bathroom and throw up, and then come back and lead the service. And I think just that little glimpse of his vulnerability and honesty and authenticity about how stressful things can be as a church planner. So my church stress doesn't go to my stomach, but it goes to my sleep. So I'll tell you, I have lost so much sleep over this baby church plant. Before we launched, we had a couple Sundays where we did preview services, and I'm so glad we did that, because there's so much that went wrong. And I remember thinking, if we don't work this out, nobody's going to come back. So I highly recommend doing those practice services. So April 14th, 2019 came around, and it was the Sunday to launch, and I think I slept 1 hour the night before. I was absolutely terrified. I'd heard several times before, you only have one chance to launch, to make that first impression. So it is incredibly important to launch well. I also remember somebody saying, when a restaurant launches, let's say they're a hamburger joint, they don't launch and say, oh, we're offering hamburgers, we're not doing French fries or milkshakes right now, come back in 6 months and we'll be offering. Like, you want to launch with as many ministries and programs as possible. So whether that's, small groups or your nursery or your kids choir or whatever it's going to be. So we tried to have as many of our ducks in a row as possible. I think there's this really interesting dynamic in being a church planter, this kind of tension in that you do all this hustle. You're kind of like this entrepreneur in some ways, and you're creating something new. And so all this incredibly hard work that you pour into it. And along with it, it's all ultimately up to God and the Holy Spirit. And this is God's church. This is not my church. But I'll tell you, I wrestle with that all the time. Like, every day, pretty much, God has to pry my fingers off the church and remind me, Patty, this is not your church. This is my church. And ultimately, if it's going to thrive or not, it's the work of the Holy Spirit. It's not my work. But for me, there's always that tension between, I've got to make this happen. Through my sheer hard work and effort, I have to make it happen. And then remembering, oh yes, it's not about me. This is God's church. And I just, each day I have to offer up my ministry and then let it go. And remember, it rests in the Holy Spirit's arms, not mine. Being flexible is incredibly important as a church planter. And so, going into this time of COVID and the global pandemic and all of that, I think that mentality has served us well to, be able to adapt, to, do what we need to do. The church plant, the Prairie campus, started as a video venue. And so for almost the whole first year, we stopped meeting in person in March. So it was 11 months after we'd launched. Is when COVID hit. That whole first year, we were a video venue. So everything was done there in the school gym, by me, by the worship director, all that, except for the sermon. And the sermon was a video of Ken Ingram, who would be preaching that morning at the downtown campus. And I have to say, I'm so grateful that first year I was not playing the sermon. I think about the church planters that are doing all that administrative stuff and all that relationship building and all that evangelism and preparing a sermon each week. I think I personally would have had a mental breakdown. I know plenty of people do it and they do it amazingly well. But I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that I wasn't doing that. And at the same time, I do know that there were times it hurt us, that there were people who would visit and who would say, wow, this is such a theological fit for us, or we love the people, it's such a warm community, but we really want live preaching. We want to get to know our pastor. We want to develop a relationship, and part of that is listening to them preach. And so even though Kent is, the best preacher in the entire world, that just was not going to work for them. So when COVID hit, and then we transitioned to doing drive-in worship, which we've been doing from May to now. I think there's been 3 or 4 Sundays where it's been too cold and we've had to cancel. Obviously, a video venue was not going to work for drive-in, so then I transitioned to being the preacher each week. And now there's no going back. It's kind of the genie out of the bottle. And it's been so helpful for us, I think, to live into more of who we are and our identity, and for me to be responsive to how I'm feeling like the people need to hear the word of God at that point in their life, whether it's George Floyd being killed or the pandemic or whatever. I'm able to be sensitive to that. So I think it came at just the right time for us to be able to kind of go to this next level, to have that live preaching. So FUMC Prairie campus, we are a graduate of Churches Planting Churches. We went to the conference the very first time it was offered. We went in Texas, so this is 2.5 years ago, and I think there were 3 or 4 different multi-site church plants that we visited, and that was so incredibly helpful because each one was different. You know, they all kind of incarnated this reality in their own way, and that's been my experience too as I've gotten to know other multi-site campuses. They each have their own unique flavor. So again, as much as you can expose yourself to that or take field trips to different ones, it's really helpful.
I had the opportunity to go to Texas with Kent, Patty, and Tiffany to attend a conference about church plants, and so opened my eyes about the way this had worked in the Texas context in a couple of different settings. And so that's a vivid memory of mine very early on, before the core group got established. And again, it was kind of a really interesting, it helped me understand this is really a challenging thing to do. And here's some outcomes that we can see in another state. But it helped me understand what lay ahead to some degree. And, it honestly fired me up a little bit. What I saw was the church's leader and his or her family. Boy, it's a big job. It's just a huge job, and I saw that. And then, I saw in a couple of different cases, really high quality music and high stuff going on, and that was so important in making it work to draw people in. But it had so much to do, again, with a personality of the person in charge. Yeah. And I think, Patty is very special, as we all know.
One of the things that we noticed on that trip is the relationship between the satellite campus and the sending church. Some of them, had these really close, supportive relationships. And then the last church we visited, they've revealed they had this really difficult relationship with the sending church, and in fact, really wanted to break off and be independent. And I think it was really helpful for us to go into this with our eyes wide open that there are various ways this could develop down the road, but how important it really is to have that healthy, functioning relationship between the campus and the sending church. I'm really fortunate that Kent and I, the senior minister, now we've worked together for 9 years, but we'd worked together for 6 years before we planted this church, and just have this really wonderful, collegial, fun, supportive relationship with one another. But I have to say, I do wonder, someday he's going to retire and there'll be a new senior minister of First United Methodist Church. And I really hope that the conference is incredibly intentional about choosing somebody who is supportive of the multi-site model. So I worry about that, or I worry about when he's gone and I'm gone, 10 years from now, how will this all evolve? Will the Prairie campus stay a satellite campus? Will it break off someday and be its own independent one? And, God only knows, hopefully whatever happens is best for the thriving of that faith community.
At first, I was so unsure, and then when we started talking about having carts with all the equipment that we were going to roll into the school and set up, I thought, oh, I can't do this. But, and then the reality of it was that, my anxieties were just dashed away because, the cart thing, the setting up, as much work as it was, we had such a sense of purpose and community doing it every week.
The only thing I'd add is it has been a time of a lot of uncertainty in the church. And so as in those days when we were first getting started, we didn't quite know what to expect. But we had a lot of confidence in Kent and Patty and what their vision was for this thing. And as we got involved with the core group and thought about where this might go, our greatest hopes were realized in what was going to happen.
What draws us to the church and keeps us coming back week after week are the people. They're the most kind, loving, genuine people that I have ever met. The values and the beliefs of the Methodist Church align with our own personal values and beliefs, the inclusiveness, the accepting, and sacrificing part of yourself to better serve others and those around you within your community and within the world. It's also important to us that our children grew up knowing Christ, learning about Christ, knowing how to be a good person, to show kindness, and to go out into the world and spread that. And they receive that through the children's ministry at the Prairie campus. We have been part of it for 2 years. We have loved every minute of it. We are excited to see what the next few years brings as the church expands and grows and continues to serve others.
Each week, Patty would have a moment where she'd ask some member of the congregation or some member of our group to step forward and share a favorite scripture or a moment of their wanting to share their faith. And I just had returned from a trip back to Illinois with Randy to his hometown. He grew up in this beautiful farming community. And we came back to rolling hills of corn and soybeans, and it was just beautiful. And so I was just struck by that image of the farmers and what they create from planting a seed. And the week before that, we had left the Prairie campus and we had taken in our first group of members. And it was such a special Sunday, that very first Sunday. And thinking about the seeds that we were planting there at the Prairie campus was just kind of very emotional, to think that that was the first group of folks that we were taking in. And I think about those seeds that we've planted and the harvest that might take place sometime down in the future. Who knows what we've planted and how it will be spread around in that community, in Colorado Springs, and the world. But it's that feeling of, just like the farmer planting a seed. That's who we are, the Prairie campus.
I just say, it's been a tough year in this year of COVID, and just the fact that this church got started and has prevailed and has adapted during this extraordinarily challenging time just gives me renewed faith in the goodness of people, the importance of community, the dramatic importance of community, how much we've missed it and how much we still have it as part of this little growing seed of a church.
Just, I've been a mentor for Patty, and we've worked together on the big ideas, but I've let her and her team lead that congregation and go. So I've gotten to watch it. I read the newsletter, I watch the services on Sunday. I preach there 3 or 4 times a year now, and get out there for special events. But just to watch it, just to watch it is a sense of verifying the call that the people that are out there are there because God has called them to be there, and this is a powerful experience for me. And it's all new. I'm not a church planter. Never wanted to be. I don't have the experience or the insights into that. But to be able to have a part in it and watch it happen has just been a blessing for me.
I just go back in my mind all the time to that scripture that Kent Ingram preached on that first Sunday 3.5 years ago about what are we doing with the talents that God has given us. Are we burying them, or are we taking risks for the gospel? And it's an incredibly scary ride, but again, it's been one of the best and hardest things I've ever done. And I think we're all called to take risks for the gospel.